6:12, June 6, 1944, Dog Green, Omaha Beach. The sea wore a cold grey that got into the bones. The LCVP's ramp chain rattled like a clock running out, diesel breath hanging in the men's throats. Private Eddie Santoro of the 116th Infantry, 29th Division, cupped an 8-round clip for his M1 Garand as if it were luck you could hold. He smelled salt, wet canvas and cordite drifting in from somewhere beyond the haze where great guns thumped at a stately, inhuman tempo. Ahead, the Vierville draw sliced the bluff like a keyhole. In the troughs between waves, he glimpsed other boats, then more boats behind those, so many that the very horizon seemed made of hulls. He had worked Brooklyn piers and knew what a loaded morning looked like. This was that feeling made into weather. The coxswain shouted, "Stand by!" and the boat yawed, threading past a forest of obstacles, the X-shaped steel hedgehogs, the crab-claw Belgian gates, while Tracer stitched the surface in shallows that were suddenly too bright. Something slapped the hull. 2 men went down, then got back up because there was exactly nowhere to go that wasn't forward. Eddie's Garand felt warm already, though he hadn't fired it. He could hear a machine gun up on the bluff, a flat rip with a metallic aftertaste. The MG-42, the Germans' sewing machine of death, a sound veterans said you never forgot. A voice crackled on a handset, Beachmaster traffic words clipped and calm, trying to turn surf into a schedule. Shower for the American beaches was 6:30. The tide had been chosen to expose obstacles. Even facts had a cadence out here. Far offshore, one of the battleships, Nevada, maybe Texas, walked 14-inch shells along the heights, the air shuddering in long, rolling breaths. Eddie felt it in his ribs before he believed it. Something about that distant, measured violence made the nearer terror survivable. The ramp smacked down and the world tilted into water and metal. Men splashed into waist-cold surf, the Garand's on-block clip clicking into place with a sound he had learned to love. He would remember the colour of the shingle, brown and red, and the way the bluffs seemed to lean. He would remember a stranded LCVP disgorging a tripod for a .30 caliber like a delivery truck missing its stop. And he would remember thinking, absurdly, that the beach looked like a yard with work to do. He lunged for a hedgehog, boots heavy, breath counting itself. The first bullet he truly heard was the one that cracked past his ear and said he was still alive. In that instant he understood that bravery might be only a tight grip and the next wet step. He moved, and the line moved with him, like a shift starting in a factory without walls. Up on the bluff, Feldwebel Otto Reiser of the 352nd Infantry Division pressed his cheek to a cold periscope slit and found the lanes he had memorized by lamplight. Wider Stan's Nestor linked sight lines in a lattice he could see with his eyes closed. A mortar here pre-registered on the shingle, a pack gun there covering the draw, belts of the MG-42 overlapping until nothing below could live if it stayed. He had checked line after line on the ammunition chalkboard. Scarcity was a clock you felt with the pads of your thumbs. He pulled the butterfly trigger, and the gun spoke that vicious high-cycle tongue, 1,000 rounds a minute if you let it run, the barrel steaming, the assistant gunner swapping belts with that practiced dance of feed and change that meant survival. Bodies slammed the water. The beach churned. He shifted traverse and elevation, short controlled bursts, doctrine against panic. Still, where one boat stalled, 2 more seemed to replace it. It offended arithmetic. Static divisions like his were supposed to slow an assault until reserves could counterattack, but a reconnaissance plane droned high and lazy and reminded him of the order every man on this coast had learned by heart: move by night, hide by day, and pray the weather stayed bad enough to keep the enemy grounded. The weather had not obliged. A runner skidded into the bunker, breathless, telephone line wrapped around his shoulder like a dead snake. The forward position to their left had lost its field wire. The right-hand nest was jammed by smoke and dust. No word since dawn. Otto kept the gun chattering, felt for the next barrel, and counted the belts again because numbers made sense when faith buckled. He saw a landing craft pivot hard, men tumbling, a flagman signalling, discipline down there too, he had to admit, even under fire. They moved like people who believed their schedule mattered. A shell landed short, spraying the embrasure with grit. He recognized naval gunfire by the way the earth thumped and then rang, a bell struck inside the hill. Somewhere seaward, a destroyer had come closer than sense allowed. The gun team flinched, then set their shoulders the way one sets a jaw before the dentist. He thought of home, of the chalky taste of ersatz coffee, of promises from radios that hadn't sent him a single case of ammunition in 2 weeks. He worked the trigger again because work was what he had. The beach did not thin, it thickened. He adjusted his sights and kept firing into the tide of men whose replacements already seemed to be on the water. Lieutenant Commander Ruth Ruddy Malloy stood braced on the bridge wing of a Fletcher-class destroyer and read chaos through a headset, broken phrases from the beach, pinned, concrete, enfiladed, then a map grid barked by a voice steady enough to deserve an answer. Doctrine said, "Keep your distance." The surf and the men inside it said otherwise. "Come to course 090, she ordered. "Flank." The bow bit white water, and the ship shouldered in toward a coastline that bit back. The fire control party shifted from indirect to direct lay, the Mk-37 director and rangekeepers dancing their numbers as the 5-inch 38 elevated. At 1,000 yards, the embrasures were no longer abstractions. You could see where the concrete breathed. The first salvo cracked and the ship shuddered as if pleased. "Up 50, right 15, the gunnery officer said, voice trimmed short as a bosun's haircut. A second salvo. Dust cinched the bunker like a hood. On shore, an infantry lieutenant lay half-submerged behind a steel obstacle and keyed an SCR 300, pushing out a correction in a tone that made courage sound like bookkeeping. Counter-battery splashes jumped closer, white spear points around the hull. Ruddy kept her course. BB-36. Nevada thundered far astern, 14-inch shells walking the ridge in stately paces, but it was the destroyers that would break the deadlock. The crew fed hot brass by hand, cotton gloves scorching, sleeves blackened with soot and oil. Rate of fire mattered in a way that felt theological. A ship designed to duel cruisers in blue water was now an assault gun on a moving street, slewing left and right with helm orders crisp as rifle drills. Stencils on crates told a second story. Ammunition states, powder bags, the arithmetic of how long you could keep this up. On D-Day, the Allied Armada counted 6,900-plus vessels of every size, and here were the sharp knives in that kitchen, carving concrete at pistol range. Ruddy thought of the absurdity and smiled. Destroyers as carpenters, shaping a door where there had been a wall. A hit punched the bunker's face flat. Men surged across the shingle in that small, lethal window the guns could make. The impossible statistic of the day rode in under the smoke. Her ship alone would fire hundreds of 5-inch rounds before dusk. Nevada had already loosed 300-plus 14-inch shells, more high-explosive weight in a few hours than some German infantry regiments could expect in artillery support for a month. That was extravagance turned into doctrine. Ruddy lifted the handset and said, matter of fact, "Shift target." Next embrasure. The helm answered with a slight turn that felt like consent. By mid-morning, Eddie learned the beach had a grammar. Engineers spoke it with Bangalore torpedoes slithering under wire, with bulldozers shoving sand like stubborn cargo, with hand signals that moved boats the way a pier boss moves trucks. He recognized hierarchy in the chaos. Beachmasters with pistols and whistles, coxswains reading flags, rifle squads waiting on a lane the way dockmen wait on a cleared berth. The M1 Garand bucked in his hands with that smooth, semi-automatic rhythm. 8 rounds, the ping of the clip, thumb quick to feed the next. Somewhere a platoon sergeant's voice still had its parade ground steel. He would remember that voice longer than most faces. The sea itself seemed to pulse on a schedule. LCVPs slewed in, dropped ramps, backed out. LCMs shouldered tanks through the chop. UKWs waddled ashore with radios stacked like loaves. It was not order without fear. It was order despite fear, the kind that can live only when thousands of people have been taught to do their job without a new permission slip every minute. Eddie had seen ship lines cut and re-rigged on the fly after a snapped cable. Here, entire boat lanes shifted around a burning wreck as if the accident had been a drill you'd always planned to run. Facts turned into texture. About 73,000 Americans would be ashore by nightfall among roughly 156,000 Allied troops under a sky patrolled by more than 11,000 aircraft. He felt those numbers not as boasts, but as pressure, like weight on a beam you test by leaning your shoulder into it. On the shingle, a lieutenant with an SCR-300 worked a target adjustment to the offshore guns, his handset cord slick with seawater. A cursing corporal dragged a crate of 30 caliber belts that might keep a single machine gun talking for an hour. Then a track clanked by hauling what looked like a week's worth. Scale made heroism breathable. A wounded man was ferried back to the waterline on a door that had been a barrier 10 minutes earlier. Medics moved as if memorizing a prayer. Eddie stepped past a hedgehog nicked by naval splinters and felt the tiny shame of being grateful for steel you hadn't lifted. The beachmaster's voices stitched the seconds together. Green 2, open. Red 1, congested. Send the next serial to white. The colour code made death sound like logistics. The logistics made more men live. When Eddie finally crawled into the mouth of the Veerville draw, he understood the day differently. It wasn't a single push. It was a machine that refused to stop, each gear finding the next tooth until motion itself became the weapon. He wiped brine from his eyes and saw traffic forming where chaos had been. The tide turned and the workday kept going. At noon, Otto shaded his eyes with a grit-blackened knuckle and found roads that should have been busy lying empty under a hot, pitiless sun. Orders spoke of counterattack, of armoured fists punching the invader off the sand, but the sky made new rules. Fighter bombers prowled at altitudes where a man could see the pilot's helmet flash. The first pair came in low along a hedgerow, guns twitching. A fuel lorry erupted into a smear of orange that stank of tar and panic. Half a company feeding into a lane reversed in an instant, men scattering under ditches they dug last week to stop someone else. He had been told to conserve ammunition. The word conserve sounded different when the enemy's economy did not seem to believe in it. A Feldwebel learned to prize movement, to gather, to mass for effect, but every attempt to do so by daylight now ended in smoke or stillness. The weapon was not only the bomb that landed, it was the knowledge that any bomb could land at any time. Otto looked up again and tried to imagine what the world looked like to those pilots. Tiny roads, harder targets, the clean arithmetic of speed and altitude. He tried and failed. His world had shrunk to what could hide. A messenger from a rear battalion arrived breathless. 21st Panzer Division had pushed, been checked, pulled back, pushed again. The pattern was familiar to anyone who had watched a strong swimmer caught in a rip. He wiped his face and tasted dust. The telephone line was down again and then briefly alive, a spasmodic creature. He had counted his MG belts 3 times today because numbers were the only things that didn't lie to him. The belts didn't lengthen. The boats at the beach didn't stop. On a corpse-strewn farm track, he found a cardboard box with English words and a smiling cow stamped on it. K-ration. The chocolate bar inside tasted like a different century. He felt something like anger and something like envy. Calories are strategy as surely as mortars, he thought, and then the thought embarrassed him for its smallness. It was not small at all. He told his gun team to wait for the shadows to lengthen. "We will move at dusk," he said, and the words felt brave and also irrelevant, like a charm against physics. A fighter bomber crossed the sun, and the hedgerow threw a brief mercy of shade over the men. The enemy owned the hours when tools and trucks prefer to move. That, more than any speech, explained the day. On Ruddy Malloy's chart, the sea had stopped being water and become capacity. Tidal windows, approach lanes, ammunition states, penciled and repenciled as the ship swung back onto picket duty, guarding lanes for LCVPS and LCMS that kept time like metronomes. Far astern, Liberty ships queued along station lines as neat as boxcars. The radio net sounded less frantic now, more like a warehouse in motion, voices prioritizing needs with the unromantic grace of people who know exactly which crate feeds, which gun. She had spent a career thinking of her destroyer as a hunter. Today it was a guardian of traffic, a pistol on a dock foreman's hip. Every few minutes, a voice on the net called a serial by colour code and minute mark. Landing craft came in, dropped ramps, took on wounded, backed out. Engineers widened exits with bulldozers that looked too humble for the history they were writing. An infantry captain, voice shredded but precise, passed a grid, and the 5-inch mounts answered with 3 quick salvos that broke a stubborn embrasure into dust. The helmsman glanced at the powder-burnt decks the way a mechanic glances at a tool and knows it has earned its keep. By afternoon, the reports tallied into awe. Thousands of vehicles ashore, ammunition and gasoline stacking into pyramids, beach lanes functioning like arteries. It was not a miracle, it was rehearsal built into people until it looked like instinct. She remembered the numbers the staff had briefed, Allied shipping committed in the thousands, aircraft sorties in the tens of thousands, and realized the enemy could not possibly see this whole machine from any single bunker. No one could, not even her, and she had the chart. Then came the impossible truth carried in plain statements. By the end of June, despite a storm that would soon tear the American artificial harbour to pieces, Allied forces would have pushed more than 850,000 troops, 148,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of supplies across these beaches. An open shoreline, under fire and wind, would outrun what many pre-war planners thought only deep-water ports could do. America's factories had already decided that this timetable would be kept. The ocean was being taught to cooperate. As dusk slid over the lane buoys, Eddie's platoon cleared the Vierville draw, and the path behind them filled with trucks as if the ground had always intended to be a road. Ruddy ordered a course change to cover the next sector. The bow came around with a confidence she envied in people. Out beyond the darkening sea line, more ships waited their turn. Schedules, she thought, are a kind of courage. Then she told the guns to stand by. Tomorrow had already started. D+10, June 16th, 1944, the wind came in fists, tearing at canvas and temper alike. The American artificial harbour at Omaha, Mulberry A, heaved and twisted until its blocky caissons groaned like ships dying on a reef. Pontoon roadways snapped, rhino ferries pitched and clawed. Lines parted with gunshot pops that sent men reflexively ducking as if under fire. Word rolled down the beach in curses and clipped orders. The harbour we had hammered together out of steel and faith was coming apart. German radio, if you believed rumour, was already crowing. Eddie Santoro stared across water flecked white as broken crockery and waited for the inevitable. Slowdown, stoppage, backlog, fear. Instead, he watched the beachmasters' faces go narrow and calm in that way certain leaders get when a plan breaks and they arrive in the moment they secretly trained for. "Open beach ops," one said, as if the phrase had always been waiting under his tongue. Engineers dragged new lines into place. Seabees slung fresh pontoon sections like carpenters throwing up a porch before supper. UKWs waddled through surf the storm hadn't read about, bringing radios, medical chests and coffee that tasted like victory diluted in brine. An LCM nosed in sideways, disgorged a dozer, and backed out like a tug with places to be. Ruddy's destroyer rode the gale on short scope, engines churning to hold station while her guns stayed silent for once. Her job now was to keep a hostile shoreline honest while Americans argued with physics. A boatswain's mate knelt to lash a sprung fender using a knot he'd learned from an uncle who had never seen the Atlantic. Improvisation wore old hands. On shore, a wrecked caisson, half submerged, became an anchor point for a makeshift pier. Somebody chalked a lane name on it because lanes require names if they are to behave. Otto, peering from a rain-streaked ruin farther inland, heard that the Americans had lost their harbour. He permitted a private nod. Then he saw the traffic, not thin but thicken, the flow finding new banks the way a river will after a flood. The harbour had been a promise. The open beach was a vow kept without help. He thought of the word ersatz and tasted the cheap bitterness of it. By nightfall the storm still hit like a grievance, but the cranes on the surf line were moving, and the stacks of jerry cans were taller, not shorter. Eddie passed a medic station thrown up under a shivering tarpaulin and watched a corpseman pour morphine into a world that refused to stop. Everywhere he looked, men treated damage as just another order to fill. The sea had tried to take the shift off. The shift worked late. Late June turned the bocage into a chessboard someone had spilled sugar on. Every hedgerow, a green wall, every lane a throat. The maps did not explain the smell. Wet soil, crushed leaves, sweat cooked in wool, the sweet metallic breath of spent brass. Eddie learned the feel of a hedgerow under his palm, and the way a machine gun's cone of fire could skim a lane at knee height. You did not sprint, you surged and stuck. You let the Garan's 8 shots keep talking while a buddy crawled 3 yards that could be his life. The platoon's language filled with short words. Go. Set. Up. He never heard anyone say heroic, though he saw it twice before lunch. The solution came not from speeches, but from scrap. Battalion motor pool welded pronged cutters, Cullen devices, onto Sherman M4 noses, teeth fashioned from steel ripped off beach obstacles. Tanks that would have stalled like cattle in a thorn thicket, now shouldered hedges open with rude method, snouts punching green into doorways. Infantry rode the shock, Garans snapping, BARs sawing. Radios, those temperamental little gods, made the rhythm real. A tank commander's request, a squad leader's answer, an artillery time on target that landed like a decision from a higher court. The cutters looked ridiculous. They worked like sin. Otto, fixed behind one more hedge, felt the geometry fail him. Terrain had been his ally all week. Now it betrayed secrets to men who had learned its new language overnight. He watched an M4 with a white stencil number slide into view, nose bristled like some industrial boar, and his first burst rang off sloped armour into the dirt. The tank did not bother to answer with its main gun. A coaxial .30 caliber stitched the hedge, and he tasted bark and cordite. He fell back 3 furrows, counted his people, counted his belts, found both counts lower than he liked. A company runner brought more bad news delivered without drama. Roads being cut through fields by bulldozers, lanes marked by chalk, replacements appearing with clean boots and dirty faces inside a week. Eddie, cleaning his rifle under a dripping hedge, realised his unit's losses were real and heavy, yet the company had more radios now than it had 3 days ago. The American answer to attrition seemed to be more the most unpoetic verb in war and the most decisive. When the tank nosed through the next hedge, its cutter dripping leaves, Eddie went forward into the man-made doorway and felt the air change. A lane unrolled toward a farmhouse that would be a line on the map by dusk. The bocage had been a maze. Now it was a job site. By the end of June, the beaches looked less like battlefields and more like the loading dock of a continent. Vehicle parks grew in geometric flocks. Jeeps, half-tracks and M4s aligned as if a draftsman had sketched them into the French earth. Ammunition pyramids rose with wood-lathed precision, lacquered crates stencilled in a typography of war, Cal 30, Cal 50, He 105 millimeters. Fuel jerrycans stacked into tidy brown ziggurats that smelled like a filling station had sprouted in a wheat field. Jean Lefebvre's orchard stood inside a road net that had not existed last week. A bulldozer idled beneath her apple trees and purred like a farm animal that had swallowed a furnace. Every hour had a hum. Bulldozers chewed spurs off main supply routes. Seabees swung pontoon sections into place with cranes that flattered the surf by assuming cooperation. Truck columns rolled in schedules that no single officer fully owned, but all obeyed. Eddie recognized the discipline of appetite. Coffee urns steaming, mail sacks sorted, bandages counted with the same reverence as bullets. He felt the war widen past any place a man could point to. If he looked up, you could almost hear it, the clatter of logistics serving intention. The impossible statistic arrived like a rumour you already believed. More than 850,000 Allied troops ashore by 30 June, 148,000 vehicles, 570,000 tons of supplies. Those numbers were not decorations on a speech, they were road surface underfoot. A corporal could step on 570,000 tons and not feel the difference except that the chow line got shorter. Somewhere back home, factories in crescendos, 2,710 Liberty ships stamped into existence with a clock's cruelty. Tens of thousands of M4 Shermans built, the count of them alone, making mockery of scarcity. You could stand in Jean's orchard, peel an apple with a mess knife, and know that one nation had produced more cargo hulls in a few years than some empires had in their proudest decades. It sounded like boasting. It looked like trucks. Otto watched a convoy cross a field where, 2 days earlier, a pond had stood. Engineers had laid brush, rock and crushed rubble, then tamped it into a promise heavy vehicles could keep. He had read staff complaints about gasoline. Here he saw an American answer in steel and habit. He remembered a K-ration chocolate and realized it had been prophecy sweetened to make it swallowable. Replacement rates, not speeches. Throughput, not theatre. At dusk, the park lights flicked on, hooded, cautious, and men moved in the luminous half-safety that industry buys. A chaplain said a prayer between a truck bay and a first aid tent. The only wind was the engine-warm breath of machines cooling for the night. The war felt decided in paperwork and grease. Tomorrow would make it obvious. When the smoke thinned enough for counting to matter, the ledger of the sea arranged itself into cause and effect. What felt like improvisation from a foxhole had, from Ruddy Malloy's bridge and from staff tents ashore, been a score performed in key. D-Day itself had put roughly 156,000 Allied troops ashore, about 73,000 of them Americans, on a timeline chosen by tide to expose obstacles and by weather to grant a narrow mercy. The fleet that carried them, 6,900-plus vessels, including the landing craft that turned waves into loading ramps, had been arranged like an argument no rebuttal could match quickly enough. The air figures read like a verdict. More than 11,000 Allied aircraft over the lodgement, sorties stacked until daylight became a permit stamped US-UK usage. German doctrine of operational manoeuvre could not breathe in that sky. Even the storm that smashed Mulberry A did not produce the expected dip. The graph line of tonnage went on as if the sea had filed a complaint and been ignored. By 30 June, the ledger listed what any corporal could see. Over 850,000 troops, 148,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of supply landed across beaches that had started the month as geography and ended it as infrastructure. Eddie remembered details that the ledger could not hold. The rubber taste of a canteen refilled from a canvas water buffalo, the sound a bulldozer makes when it climbs a fresh-cut bank, the hard kindness of a medic who told a man he would live while knowing it would be close. Those details fit between the numbers like mortar between stones. He also remembered the Garand's 8-shot rhythm, the democratization of firepower at the smallest scale, and how it let a squad right checks the enemy's bolt actions struggled to cash. The destroyer's role, once a rumour, read clearer with time. Point-blank gunnery at 1,000 yards or closer had pried open embrasures that airburst could not persuade. BB-36, Nevada, old dreadnought from another war, had spent more high explosive on D-Day than some divisions would see in a campaign. That was not waste. It was a deliberate extravagance meant to save time, which saves lives. The ledger did not laugh, but it smiled in its way. Otto's side of the column did not lie either. Ammunition allocations thin as an apology. Fuel convoys halted by fear of sun. Replacement battalions that arrived as paper before they arrived as men. The counter-attack arrows drawn on acetate and then crossed out, rewritten, crossed out again. The ledger accepted all entries and let the sums explain themselves. History would call it Overlord. An infantryman might call it Tuesday, then Wednesday, then Thursday, until Paris. Feldwebel Otto Reiser understood the war's decision not at a surrender table, but behind a hedgerow at dusk when two fresh American companies appeared where no road had been that morning. They came forward on speed-limited discipline, packs squared, weapons clean, radios crackling with the humble arrogance of people who expected to be heard. He had, hours earlier, allowed himself a private minute of hope when someone said the American harbour was gone. Now he watched open beach operations devour that sentence and spit out traffic. He inventoried what remained to him: 2 belts for the MG, 3 hand grenades, a rifle with its bolt polished by habit into a softer shine than honest work should give. A runner brought a folded order that said counter-attack. A pilot sharked overhead and the lane filled with shoulders pressed to hedges. His men did not need a lecture to freeze. The sky spoke fluent orders. He sent one team left with the last of the stick grenades and held the others until he could feel night more than see it. In a ditch he found another K-ration box, the cartoon cow smirking in a way that would have amused him in other years. He chewed slowly, embarrassed at first, then purely animal. Calories felt like courage you could bite. If an army eats like this, he thought, then it moves like this, and talks like this on radios that seem to have been born understanding each other. A gust brought the smell of frying something, bacon, and he almost laughed at the indecency of it. He told his men they would fall back, not because they were cowards, but because their map had turned into rumour. The young ones nodded with that stiff misery that does not need philosophy. He collected the section and threaded a garden of shadows toward what his orders called a reserve line and what his eyes called a rumour. He tried to reshape the day into duty, not defeat, and found the words heavy as wet cloth. Across the field, an American bulldozer coughed to life and pushed at a bank with implacable patience. He felt a loneliness so complete it startled him. No hymn for the Reich had prepared him for a machine that sounded like a sermon on inevitability. He paused long enough to mark the sound into memory, the way a man who loves music might remember a bell. When he finally moved again, it was with the knowledge he would carry into captivity, that replacement rates are a kind of genius, and that he had fought brave men backed by something larger than bravery. Jean Lefebvre's road pointed to a city she had not seen since before the occupation, and the dust that rose from it tasted of canvas, gasoline, and a strange, clean soap the Americans used on everything. Eddie Santoro rode tailgate for a mile, and thought about how a longshoreman from Brooklyn had become a piece in a machine he finally understood without shame. Not a cog without a face, but a citizen carrying his weight along a belt line that reached from Ohio steel and Iowa corn to this French lane where Hedges had learned new manners. Ruddy Malloy's destroyer, powder scoured from her paint, lay at anchor to rearm. The crew slept like guilty thieves for 6 hours straight. The historical line ran forward as if pulled, not drawn. Operation Cobra gathering under a lid of air supremacy. Falaise waiting like a sprung trap. Paris rehearsing its liberation in whispers. The ledger's numbers had become country roads and fuel dumps and a calendar that cut tyranny into diminishing rectangles. Eddie passed a cemetery detail laying out crosses with a spacing that hurt the eyes for its precision. Abundance had not spared sacrifice. It had given sacrifice leverage. The impossible statistic to carry home would not be the largest or most ornate, it would be the plainest. A single American factory's monthly output of M1 rifles once exceeded the entire pre-war armories of nations that had bragged of conquest. 5.5 million Garans by war's end, the baseline that turned every squad into a small, reliable storm. 49,000 Shermans, the redundancy that denied the enemy the comfort of arithmetic. 2,710 Liberty ships, the drumbeat that taught the ocean the American way of time. Jean tucked a chocolate wrapper into a drawer beside old letters, a harmless relic turned into a family covenant. She had given apples to men who had handed her a blanket and a world where the police did not wear the conqueror's face. Otto, somewhere down the chain of war, would write a letter on camp stationery and search for a word that felt honest. He would choose enough and mean it bitterly and with respect. When the column paused for a traffic halt that lasted exactly as long as the corporal with the flag wanted it to, Eddie slid off the tailgate and stretched his back. The lane hummed. Radios murmured. Engines idled like cattle about to move. He looked east, where tomorrow had already been measured in tonnage and courage, and thought of the factory without walls that had taken him this far. The tide was out, the schedule was in, and the American day kept going.